Hello, my name's Wendy Earle, and I'm welcoming you to another Arts First podcast, the podcast that is dedicated to freedom of expression and arts for art's sake. My co-host today is Niall Crowley, as always, and in this episode, we examine the growing problem of constraints to freedom of expression in the arts. An arts professionals survey report published in 2020 showed that 8 out of 10 people working in the arts agreed that if you speak out against the orthodoxy in many arts institutions, you risk ostracization. This is a shocking state of affairs, given that the lifeblood of the arts is freedom of expression. Our guests today are Rosie Kay and Denise Fahmy. They set up the campaign Freedom of Expression in the Arts last year after they discovered through bitter experience that a value that is supposed to be at the very center of the arts existence is surprisingly undervalued in the arts world. So Rosie and Denise, we're delighted that you've agreed to join us today. For any lover of the arts and believer in freedom of expression, your stories are very disturbing. Having worked for many years in the arts, you each suddenly found yourselves confronted by hostility when you raised concerns about the implementation of diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. And this ultimately led to both of you losing your jobs. Could each of you start off by summarising what happened to you in your respective areas of work? Rosie, do you want to start off?
Sure. So, I really saw this coming. I saw it coming over the hill quite a long time ago because I was looking into conspiracy theory from about 2012 quite seriously onwards. And I even made a show about it, kind of trying to make a statement that the kids weren't all right, that there was some sort of level of brainwashing going on. And I was poo-pooed for it. I certainly saw the gender issue coming up, and I saw very quickly what the dangers were and the consequences if you take away the word woman. If you take the word woman to mean anybody who identifies as a woman, including men and including rapists, then we have like really serious safeguarding issues. And I didn't shut up about it. I did feel like I was in quite a secure place as an artist. I'd made a very serious reputation for myself being quite fierce, quite brave, like working with the military, working with intelligence forces. Like I know my stuff, and I'm known for knowing my stuff. So when I was raising the alarm, I thought it was really important, and it's completely genuine, and I stand by that completely now. But my situation happened at a dinner party at my house for the dancers, young dancers of a show I was working on. We hadn't had any social time because of COVID rules in the studio and outside. And it was quite late in the night. It was like after midnight. Everyone had had quite a lot to drink. And when they asked me what my next show was, which was an interpretation of Virginia Woolf's Orlando, where the hero becomes a heroine halfway through, I was told that I had to hire a trans person. And that's when I sort of pushed back and, well, I wouldn't know who that Orlando could be, if that Orlando will ever get made. But it then very quickly went into an argument, and there were two dancers who identified as non-binary. On the Monday morning back at work, I could feel the hostility, and I asked my chair to step in, not realizing that she'd also been groomed by an organization called Gendered Intelligence. And I've quickly found that I was guilty with no investigation. But I did trust in my company and my board. I did trust in people. They were part of my family almost. I went through one long investigation that was very stressful, and I was exonerated. But then one of the non-binary dancers who'd left appealed, and clearly had brought in legal support. So my company started bringing in external lawyers that were linked to one of my board members. So it was kind of looking it didn't look right. I had to bring in my own lawyers. And basically, in the end, rather than losing my job, I decided my integrity was far more important than being ostensibly blackmailed, really, with the threat of being called a transphobe. And I thought that this whole situation was being handled appallingly. I was getting rather ill from the process. So I resigned and then went public, very public. And I wanted to sort of draw attention to how ridiculous the system was. I think I was probably quite hopeful that it would help, but actually it was worse than I thought. The whole of the arts was worse than I thought, and there was more fear going around than I realised. I think taking a stand is going to pay off in the long run. I feel right about it, but it certainly cost me a lot of money. It cost me a lot of legal fees. I had to fight with insolvency lawyers and buy my own name back. But here I am, still standing.
Still going. So, I mean, as a personal point of view, did you feel like you were surrounded by people you trusted and kind of betrayed you, or were you already in a situation where you felt like you were increasingly having to be careful?
It's funny, isn't it? Because I look back and I realise now that there were signs. But I think at the time, because I was the driving force, had my name on it, all the vision, all the drive came from me. And like I said, these people, the people on my board and my manager had been at my wedding, at my child's christening. There was a sense like, well, we all know what we're doing. It's written into our charitable objects that Rosie Kay makes bold, challenging work about taboo and controversial subject matters. So, it was like, if there's a controversy, you're going to find me in it. I thought that was written in both in our relationships, but also absolutely written into the existence of why that company was there. So I regret stepping down as a director because it left me vulnerable. And I remember the arguments with my dad, who was the former chair at the time. But there was a reason for that, because I wanted to have salary and pension and pay that I'd never had in my life. So when I became a regularly funded organisation, an NPO, I thought that I was going into the sort of grown up realm. But what actually was happening was this whole idea of risk and reputational risk was becoming more important than the art itself. And I'm very much on the side of making the best art. It's so hard to make good art. It's so hard. It takes decades to learn your skills. And then you still don't know whether it's going to hit at the right moment, whether audiences are going to like it or not. You can still sometimes make the best work of art and nobody sees it. That was all I was focused on. So I probably didn't realize that other people were starting to get scared around me.
And Denise, what was your situation?
Well, I mean, I guess I was in a much safer place than Rosie, really, in terms of I had a full-time job. I'd been there a long time. I was used to, in fact, I was completely dependent on a regular salary. And I was working at the Arts Council, which was a great organisation, still is, I think, and great members of staff, great colleagues. I was also, and I'd been there for a long time, so I felt very secure. And I was also trade union rep and quite high up in the trade union, so I knew, a lot of details of how things were running within the organisation in terms of staff relations, really. So I was quite involved in that. And I did see more and more difficulties coming through with staff relations that were about politics, really, weren't necessarily about regular day-to-day things that go on at work. They were more about kind of how people engaged with each other around political issues. And I thought that was affecting people's professional conduct as well. So this was a kind of a strange situation to be in. At the same time, I was kind of looking into, well, I was hearing more about the what was going on in the debate between the trans rights and women's rights. And I didn't entirely understand it, to be honest, to begin with. There were some changes that started to be demanded in the workforce around pronoun use in emails and things like that, which initially I thought, okay then. And then I started to read about it and thought, actually, this is a little bit odd, really, because I felt uncomfortable with the demands being made, especially as a lot of us didn't really understand it. And so gradually I just started to find out more about that discussion, and it must have been about 2019 when I started looking at the data set that we were using in the arts, both as employees and as funders. And having looked at that, I thought I was really surprised how that data set wasn't as it appeared. So obviously initially I thought we were just using the protected characteristics in the Equality Act and asking people about whether they're men or women, but those categories had kind of disintegrated at the Arts Council, and I hadn't realised that was happening. So, and the Arts Council was also trying to roll out the categories that it was using in the sector with its own employees. So as a trade unionist, I was involved in that process as well. So gradually became aware of what was going on outside my employer. And one of the first things that really woke me up to this being an agenda, not really about politics, but about bullying. And that was a bit of a penny dropping moment, really, because before that, I kind of felt we were having a discussion about politics. But at some point, I realized we really weren't. We were having a discussion about whether you're allowed to bully people or not, if you say certain things, whatever those things are. And the moment that happened for me is I went to an artist studio, and there was a opening event, an open studio, and one of the artists was leaving because she had been accused of being transphobic. When I got to her studio, where again she'd been a long time, and the space she'd helped to set up the space, her studio space was surrounded by the pink and white and blue trans flag, and she was whispering to me, and she was really pleased I'd come because I was, I worked at the Arts Council, so I had a bit of kudos at that point in my life. But she was actually whispering to me because she was afraid. And this was a middle-aged, well-established artist, afraid in her workplace. And I was really shocked by that, really, really shocked, because initially I had thought we were just talking about differences of opinions, really. So following that, I then put out a call for case studies in whilst I was at the Arts Council on Twitter, and a number of people got in touch telling me that they had been chased out of studio groups, or were fearful of even in employed work, were fearful of saying what they thought around this gender critical trans issue. And at that point, I found out about Rosie, and I got in touch with Rosie and trying to see what was happening, whether actually as the Arts Council could help her in that situation. In actual fact, it is very difficult for the Arts Council to step in to an organisation when it's a small organisation and the work relations have fallen apart. It's quite difficult for a funder to actually do anything about that, really. Well, if it's a very small organisation. So I put together the case studies and I sent them to our chief executive, who I knew very well and know him as a decent. And it was kind of brushed aside in some way, which I was quite shocked, because the case studies are pretty awful.
Yeah.
Rosie's case was, Rosie was public. Many people weren't. And I was really, really quite shocked by what I read. And, I began to feel like I couldn't, if the director of the funding agency wasn't interested in widespread bullying in his own sector, then we really had a problem. We really weren't, safeguarding our sector. And at that point, there was also an applicant called LGB Alliance who received a grant, very small grant of £10,000 from a devolved funder. So we'd given the funding, and national lottery funding. It was a tiny amount of money because in that year we gave out, well over £1 billion. So £10,000 was pretty minimal. And there was a meeting, because the grant had been called, because a grant had been made, one of our directors called a meeting of all staff to discuss this, which it was never ever happened before. And and it was very clear that he didn't support a grant being made to this applicant because he didn't agree with them. Now, I found that very, very shocking, because having been at the Arts Council for many, many years, I'd never seen that happen, that level of intolerance from a public funder. And I felt very strongly it broke the public sector equality duty. You can't withdraw public services to people you don't agree with. That's a basic tenet of our democracy. So I actually made a complaint to the Secretary of State because of that. But because I'd, raised my voice in this all staff meeting that took place in April, saying, well, I think that is against free speech, it led to some of my colleagues setting up a petition against me, and 140 colleagues signed this petition. And some colleagues used really appalling language, which we've all come to expect now in this area, haven't we? That we're Nazis or fascists or Islamophobe, I was called. Absolutely crazy. I found I was very, very distressed by it. And I had thought of myself as quite a tough cookie, having made my way through various disciplinaries and supporting people through disciplinaries. But I was much more distressed by it than I thought I would be. And it really shook up my confidence in the organisation, because the organisation hosted the petition for 30 hours. And then when I made a complaint about the petition, I was told it wasn't about me and not to worry about it. And, so in the end, I went to an employment tribunal to argue that I had been harassed by my colleagues, and that was upheld against the Arts Council. And it was the first test, I think, of the Forstater employment tribunal, where she won her case on the grounds of belief. So it was the first test of that idea that you can't be discriminated against for being gender critical, and if you are, your employers will be held responsible. So there I was. I'd kind of fallen out. I'd fallen away. I'd fallen out of love, really, with my job, and it was like a divorce. And it was. I think Rosie mentioned that thing about trust. Do you still trust people around you? And I didn't. And that was a horrible feeling, to not trust your colleagues anymore.
Yeah. When I read and heard your stories originally, in both cases, I was sort of shocked, kind of at the personal level, because you just see how can people behave like that towards each other for some cause that they're not necessarily even directly affected by. It's just some kind of moral principle.
I'd heard your stories before, and I guess, as you've alluded to, they're not uncommon experiences, even if you were at the sharp end of this, but it's been happening all over the arts for a while, and there seems to be a pervasive atmosphere in the arts that there's a right or a wrong way of thinking about things, and if you disagree with contemporary orthodoxies, then you might find yourself ostracised or even worse. Is that how you'd see it?
What I've observed over the years of working in a funding agency, which is somewhat removed in a way from the arts, you are a little bit protected, I think. But what I've observed is this idea of the arts and the funder as having a kind of moral purpose. And if you take if you see yourself as a moral organisation, to a degree, you make yourself unchallengeable. And you do start to think of yourself as always in the right and always orthodox. And it's really quite difficult to then self-reflect, to look at yourself as an organisation and think, well, hang on, perhaps we're wrong. This is why I think so many of these cases have come about in the public sector, which sees itself as having a moral position in society.
There's also a wider artistic thing, isn't there, where increasingly it seems like artists are supposed to have a kind of a mission. There's been all of this idea of art galleries and museums being centres of social change, and that kind of social intervention has become something that's been building up for the last 30 years or so.
The instrumentalism in the arts, I suppose it was maybe clearer in the 80s. And then through the Blair years, which was sort of like actually good years for the arts, because there was suddenly much more funding because of the National Lottery, the instrumentalism sort of changed and shifted and became slightly more insidious in some regards, like less clear cut. And artists were sort of just, I think, by degree, moving themselves into positions in order to get the funding. And so there's a real vulnerability to, first of all, you're playing the system, but then in effect, you become the system. I was a big believer in the subsidised art, like fund the risky stuff, the difficult stuff, and let that build into the more commercial spheres. I did believe in that system. Maybe I still do to a degree, but that level of subsidy with the incentives has created its own system that has been hijacked with ideas around social justice, particularly. It's changed the way the training is delivered, that activism is art, art is activism. There isn't really room for anything else. And I think the arts are particularly vulnerable to fads and to fashions. And that has led to a groupthink, along with decrease in grassroots. And it has become a very middle class, bureaucratically minded sphere. That's without doubt, like who would go and get in debt to that level. I mean, even for me with the free trade, I was probably the last year that got a free dance degree. Even then I was like, how the hell do I survive? But to come out of a dance degree with that level of debt, you've got to have some sort of security around you. So the arts themselves are attracting a different type of person that might be more willing to do the administration and the bureaucracy. So it's sort of like fulfilling itself. It's incentivizing through the funding. It's curators are encouraging it through thematic issues, and the artists are feeding that system. So they're all congratulating themselves, but it's become groupthink, and it's become increasingly massively intolerant. And I would suggest that the artists suffered as well, because the arts should be the place where we're challenging the depths and heights of humanity, not repeating or lecturing in some sort of sermon, proselytizing to a rather dense audience, everything from climate change to veganism to non-binary identities. There's a sort of slate of approved views, and you'll find that a lot of the subsidized art is espousing these views, and they don't have, because of the subsidy, they don't have to sell tickets or have big audiences. They're cushioned somewhat from their own failures.
It seems like there's a kind of a tick box culture. You're expected bureaucratically to fulfill certain criteria and you get support for that, but also maybe a kind of brand management that goes on with particularly in the big organizations, which kind of builds a risk aversion that if you're not seen as playing the right kind of role, the definitions of or the expectations of diversity inclusion, it's just becoming harder and harder to avoid those demands, I suspect.
That's part of the investment principles of the Arts Council. There's 4 investment principles. 2 slightly relate to the art and 2 are absolutely not. It's to do with environmental responsibility and inclusion and relevance. And I would say lots and lots of organisations believe in it. That's a tricky thing. They believe in it. They're changing their missions to fulfil not the purpose of art or the purpose of the audience or the purpose of the taxpayer. They're there to serve the mission, which may be environmentalism or something, even though it doesn't make any sense. That's not actually what they're there to do. But they are going in and they're changing their mission and purpose to fit these aims. To go back to your previous question, I don't know exactly why that turned into such a toxic, bullying, harassing culture. I don't know why. I don't know why it turns so nasty, but it's super nasty. I deal with a lot of the cases that come to freedom in the arts, and I wouldn't believe it had it not happened to me. Let's put it that way. It's shocking, the level of behaviour and the cruelty to quite sensitive, often extremely talented, dedicated artists. I still find it absolutely shocking. It's inhumane.
I think it's true that venues and organisations are rewarded now for social activism and for taking political positions, and really that is the main way to access public funding now. It's very hard just to make work that isn't about politics and get it presented. The thing is, it doesn't ever stop. It keeps going. There's a new frontier of inclusion we haven't yet thought of, and those that think up the new frontiers, either pretty high up in the organisation or very well respected.
What you said, Rosie, about it kind of starting in the 80s with politics infringing upon the arts. I was just thinking about what the differences were, because I recognise what you said immediately, but I wonder if the difference between the 80s and now is it was much more along traditional left-wing and right-wing lines, more broader ideological things that were about how the outside world should be and how class and society, and maybe it's becoming much more petty and vicious now, because the more personal it becomes, the more vicious it becomes, and in a way it's unpolitical. People seem unable to take a step back and reflect and say, well, you have your views, I have mine. And the reason we were also shocked going into it is we come a little bit from that tradition where we expect to be able to have more of a reasonable discussion about it, but it isn't that for people, maybe.
It's almost like a metaphor of what's happened politically, isn't it? It's isolated many of us who would have considered ourselves traditionally left or liberal left or even centrist. So I suppose the arts went quite left-wing through the Thatcher era, it was sort of a place of fighting back, and there wasn't much money, but there was quite a lot of freedom. And then, like I say, with the Blair administration, more complex layers of the Arts Council's application processes. I can't remember what was before. There was Let's Create, and there was Great Art for Everyone. I can't remember the one before.
There wasn't anything before then.
Right. So what was the application process like, Denise?
The thing is, there's been quite a lot of different lottery schemes since '94. Lottery came in at the same time as freedom of information, about 4 or 5 years difference. And those two things together have had a very profound effect on all public funding. Whereas, I don't know, in 94, 95, you might be able to sit around a table and say, right, this one or this one. And that was it. After freedom of information, you couldn't do that. You had to write everything down, which was very tedious, but created a whole class of people like me, that quite like writing reports. Alongside lottery was also a much stronger sense of public benefit. And, well, hang on, if it's lottery players paying for it, and you can run a freedom of information to see why it's been awarded, we need some mechanism to prove that the public is actually benefiting from this. I mean, the most obvious mechanism, I would say, is that the monitoring should include a little tick box saying, have you played the national lottery? And nobody asks that, because they'll find out that most of their audiences have not played the national lottery, and yet they are paying for it. Or even venues having lottery tickets in them. No chance of that. Those two things coming together started to put in place a structure which gradually politicised venues more and more. And I think the thing about the EDI agenda, it demands inclusion where inclusion is not possible, such as people being able to enter each other's sex groups when they're not of that sex. But it also massively excludes. It's about exclusion as well. I mean, the example of this is the Wellcome Collections show at the moment called Hard Graft. I mean, it's had some good reviews, actually, and there are some interesting pieces in it. And it's curated by the recent curator of the French Pavilion in Venice. She's come and curated this show called Hard Graft. It's split into 3 sections. So the graft is split into the graft that was used in the slave trade on plantations, the grafting that's done on the street by prostitutes who are called sex workers, and the grafting in the home, housework. And what amazed me is there isn't a single working manual worker in the show, even though Euston is absolutely surrounded by men in hard hats and yellow jackets, building HS2 in theory, rebuilding London. So those men are completely excluded, and these groups are into the idea of work, labouring. So it's a highly inclusive show whilst deeply exclusive.
Sounds like there's a whole study to be done, if it hasn't already been done, about how the working class has kind of been washed out of the arts over the last 30 or 40 years. Because when you look at the biographies of some of the artists now that are kind of entering their 60s, 70s, 80s, and how they came from working class roots, now you wonder whether that's even happening anymore. So now perhaps we should be moving towards a close. Do you have any sort of final questions?
I guess, where do we think this censoriousness and consequent self-censorship, what it means and where it's going? And maybe if there's sounds a bit odd, but if there's a plus side to it, if there's something positive coming out of it, maybe new alliances, people finding ways to do things in a different way outside of these structures and forms that have come up over the last 40 years and this over-regulation.
Just thinking about the next frontier of moral high ground, I mean, I can certainly see the reparations agenda starting to hit the arts, organisations starting to set up reparation funds, and then, having said that, there might be good stuff that comes out of that, because it might be approached in a more collaborative way. So you might well see more international collaborations with artists as well, but that also excludes others. So there's always that give and take. But I mean, we're certainly feeling from the organisations that we've spoken to that they want us to come in and have an open discussion and start to kind of open up that arena. And so from that, we're hoping to run a series of roundtables with leaders in the arts and with artists to talk about how we can just have discussions without fear. That's the thing, isn't it? We call it unlearning the fear habit. You shouldn't be afraid. This is a free country.
Yeah, senior leaders in the arts are well aware that there are issues and that at any moment an issue could explode in their very faces and the risks are very high. I think there's also a sense that there hasn't been much leadership, and so everyone's been a little bit floundering on their own and thus has become very censorious and risk averse. I feel like that leaders are really waking up to that and need a bit of help and support and guidance just to say it's fine, it's all right, it's okay to talk about it. Me and Denise have been through the fire. You can burn us again, but we'll still carry, we really believe in this, we care, and we want to have a healthy arts world. We really do. We don't want to be running freedom in the arts for much longer than the next 4 years or so, 4 or 5 years. And if we fail, we fail, but at least we've given it a good shot. So we're going to put a survey out that we're going to ask artists and anyone that works in the arts to fill in confidentially. You can be completely anonymous. I want to stress that, totally anonymous. I will never know who's filled in some of these surveys, but if you want to give us your name, then we will always follow up and thank you and possibly ask to interview you. And we want to build up a picture in comparison to the 2019 Arts Professional Survey. Have things got worse, or maybe we're wrong, maybe it's got, I'd be surprised because that's not what I'm hearing, but let's get a picture and then let's sit down with people. About a year or 2 years ago we were still facing that it's not happening, or it's a right wing, it's a culture war, or it's accountability. I do think those arguments are fading away. I think it's undeniable that things are going on, and I do feel like more and more people are being a bit braver and speaking out. My hope, the arts are vulnerable to fashions, is that actually I think it's going to be hard to get rid of this culture. I think it's really embedded and it's ingrained. But when it topples, it could topple very quickly.
If I could just add to that, actually, we were very encouraged today as well to see Index on Censorship tweeting their horror, I think, at the biohazard attack on the LGB Alliance conference last week, when people broke it. Well, they didn't break in, they got into the conference and released 6,000 crickets against the audience members. And now Index on Censorship has just expressed horror at people doing that. Now, I don't think they would have done that a few years ago. I really don't think they would have supported LGB Alliance in that way because they've been tarred as something toxic, which they're not. To me, that spoke of considerable bravery, actually, from them. And I'm really glad to see that happening. And I think that is what's happening. The adults are coming back into the room.
Well, I think it's true. I think once these things get flagged up, people are shocked when it becomes more public. I'm not sure if I'm as optimistic as you, though. I think your campaign is wonderful. I'm really glad you've set it up. It's absolutely, I wish you complete success. But I'm a bit more pessimistic, partly because I think there's something going on in wider society that we can't necessarily control, which is a kind of general sense that the side of progress, people are on the side of progress who support some of these more insidious stuff about changing ideas about race, changing ideas about gender and all of that sort of thing. And I also feel like having, a friend of mine was recently pushed out of her organization, really quite recently. And you feel like there's a layer of, whether it's a layer of management or a layer of leadership, I know the two things are linked, but that really want to avoid problems. So they kind of put quite subtle behind the scenes pressure on people, which makes it increasingly difficult for somebody to stay and resist the pressures. And they're putting that pressure on, the individual because they just don't like the questions that are being asked. Or there are enough people within the organization who don't like the questions that this individual might be asking. And I think there's something still quite insidious going on that maybe is a bit harder to push back against.
Yeah, I'm getting that a little bit with cases that it's sort of silent, secret cancellations now. People put through very, very long, labyrinthine investigation processes and people being paid off to keep quiet. Some of the practices I'm seeing, I think possibly could be illegal. So I'm quite shocked at the low level of adherence to governance. I'd like to do a piece on that. And you're absolutely right. I am starting to see particularly female board members getting just pushed out, or they get to a point where they go, oh, it's not worth it. I don't want to be the one that's labelled a TERF in a board meeting. I don't want to be that person. And I think also there are still very vocal staff members inside organisations that seem to put the fear of God into executives. And I think they're really poisoned by their own challenge, because they talk about inclusion and equity and invite, feedback from their staff. But then when they've got these really social activist staff members, they don't have the resources, they don't have the means to push back and say, no, actually, I'm paid the executive salary and I make the decisions at the end of the day. They're really kind of created a very difficult situation for themselves, because they still want to be seen as doing the right thing. There's a lot to unpick. But I think even just getting people together to talk about it is going to be difficult, but I think people are ready for it as well.
No, absolutely. I think it's really encouraging the things that you're doing, Free Speech Union, and lots of other organisations and artists standing up for themselves. Absolutely. I mean, I think it is, as Wendy says, is quite an insidious thing, and there are, it's going to be more of a long haul, I think. But I think it has been incredibly encouraging to see people all over standing up and taking sides, and very brave people like you.
Like, it feels quite existential for me, because I'm a creator, and I mean, I can dance alone in an empty room. I'm quite happy to. But going back to my art form and the discipline of it actually gives me the strength to carry on, because I believe in it, and I believe that it would be so tragic if we lose both a generation of artists for wrongthink, and we lose the younger generation who don't get any decent training. So it feels like a really important battle. That's what I want to say.
I'm reminded of that phrase about living in interesting times, and remember growing up in the 90s and the Blair years. This is so boring, isn't it? You can't say that now. Be careful what you wish for. Denise and Rosie, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure and a inspiration, and I really hope you'll come back and join us again and tell us how you're getting on with your campaign. I wish you every success, and hopefully come back and talk about some of your work as well. That would be really great. And if you want to find out more about the campaign, listeners that is, then please check out freedominthearts.com.
Yes.
And you've got a survey, so that will be the place to find it. And while we're giving out website addresses, we've got a new website / Substack. You can find us at artsfirst.uk. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.